December 8th, 1987. The sun hadn't yet burned away the morning haze over the Jabaliya refugee camp in Gaza when the collision happened. An Israeli military transport truck slammed into two civilian vehicles at a checkpoint, killing 4 Palestinian workers on their way home. Metal twisted against metal, lives extinguished in an instant. Within hours, rumors spread like wildfire through the cramped alleyways and overcrowded concrete shelters. Whispers that it was no accident, that this was revenge for an Israeli merchant stabbed days earlier in Gaza's marketplace. What those 4 families couldn't know as they prepared bodies for burial was that their grief would ignite a flame that would burn for 6 years and fundamentally alter the landscape of Middle Eastern politics forever. By nightfall, thousands had gathered. Not with guns or bombs, but with stones clutched in their fists and fury burning in their eyes. The occupation had lasted 20 years, 2 full decades since Israeli forces took control of Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem in the 1967 war. An entire generation had grown up knowing nothing but military checkpoints, arbitrary arrests, land confiscations, and the daily humiliations that accompany life under foreign rule. These young people, many still teenagers, had watched their parents' quiet acceptance, their defeated shrugs, their whispered warnings to keep your head down, don't make trouble, don't give them a reason. But something had shifted. The collision was merely the match that met the gasoline. The Israeli soldiers stationed at the Jabaliya checkpoint that evening found themselves facing something they hadn't trained for. Not armed militants or organized fighters, but waves of civilians. Women in hijabs, old men with canes, children barely tall enough to see over the barricades. They threw stones, yes, but more than that, they threw themselves against the machinery of occupation with a recklessness born of accumulated rage. Rubber bullets ricocheted off walls. Tear gas canisters clattered across the dirt roads, spewing their acrid clouds. By morning, dozens were injured, several dead, and the world's media had begun to take notice. What made this different from previous flare-ups was simple. It didn't stop. The protests spread from Jabaliya to Gaza City, then leaped across the checkpoints to the West Bank, Ramallah, Nablus, Hebron, Bethlehem. Every city, every village, every refugee camp erupted in coordinated defiance. They called it the Intifada, Arabic for shaking off, like a dog shaking water from its coat, or perhaps more accurately, like a body trying to shake off a parasite that had burrowed too deep. The organizers, to the extent that there were any in those early chaotic weeks, operated with remarkable simplicity. They didn't need formal command structures or hierarchical organizations. Instead, they used what they had: neighborhood committees, mosque networks, university student groups. A leaflet would appear overnight, plastered on walls or slipped under doors, announcing the next general strike, the next day of protest, which Israeli products to boycott. The beauty of it was its decentralization. Israeli intelligence could arrest 100 suspected leaders, and 100 more would emerge from the population like mushrooms after rain. Mahmoud was 17 when it began. He lived with his family in a 3-room apartment in Ramallah, the kind of place where privacy was a foreign concept and every conversation could be overheard through thin walls. His father worked in a furniture workshop, his mother took in laundry, and his 3 younger siblings shared a single mattress on the floor. For years, Mahmoud had walked past Israeli soldiers on his way to school, had submitted to random searches, had watched settlement construction steadily devour the hilltops surrounding his city. He'd learned to make himself small, invisible, unremarkable. But on December 10th, 2 days after Jabaliya, when his classmates began flooding into the streets, something in Mahmoud's chest unlocked. He grabbed a stone from the roadside, not a large one, nothing that could seriously harm anyone, just a piece of limestone worn smooth by time, and he threw it. The stone arced through the air and clattered harmlessly against an armored vehicle. The soldier inside probably didn't even notice, but Mahmoud noticed. For the first time in his young life, he had refused to be invisible. The Israelis, caught flat-footed by the uprising's scale and persistence, responded with increasing force. Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin, a decorated general who'd helped win the 1967 war, issued orders that would haunt him for years: break their bones. Soldiers were instructed to beat protesters rather than shoot them, the logic being that beatings generated less international outrage than corpses. But the policy backfired spectacularly when Western journalists captured footage of armed soldiers clubbing unarmed teenagers, images that played on evening news broadcasts from New York to Tokyo. The Intifada developed its own rhythm, its own vocabulary of resistance. There were the days of rage when entire cities would empty into the streets. There were the commercial strikes when shops pulled down their metal shutters in unison, leaving Israeli-controlled areas looking like ghost towns. There were the tax rebellions, villages refusing to pay fees to an authority they didn't recognize. And always, constantly, there were the stones, thousands upon thousands of them, flung by hands too young to remember life before occupation. But something was shifting beneath the bloodshed. For the first time, Palestinians weren't relying on Arab armies or foreign intervention to advance their cause. They were doing it themselves, claiming agency over their own fate. The images beaming out to the world weren't hijackers or bombers, the dominant Western perception with Palestinians for decades, but civilians facing down military might with rocks and resilience. International opinion began to turn. Countries that had long supported Israel unconditionally started asking uncomfortable questions. Human rights organizations issued damning reports. Even within Israel, voices of dissent grew louder. Peace Now, an Israeli protest movement, held rallies calling for withdrawal from the occupied territories. Soldiers began refusing service in the West Bank and Gaza, willing to face military prison rather than enforce the occupation. The uprising transformed Palestinian politics in unexpected ways. For years, the Palestine Liberation Organization, led by Yasser Arafat from exile in Tunis, had dominated Palestinian nationalism. But the Intifada was homegrown, led by people who'd never left Palestine, who didn't need Arafat's permission to resist. New organizations emerged from the streets: Hamas, Islamic Jihad, groups that mixed nationalism with religious fervor and rejected the secular orientation of the old guard. This created a dilemma for Arafat. He could see his relevance slipping away, could feel the younger generation's impatience with his endless negotiations that produced no results. In November 1988, facing irrelevance, he made a dramatic gamble. At a meeting of the Palestinian National Council in Algiers, he declared an independent state of Palestine, symbolically claiming the West Bank and Gaza. More significantly, he explicitly recognized Israel's right to exist and renounced terrorism. It was a seismic shift. For decades, the PLO had rejected Israel's legitimacy entirely. Now, driven by the uprising's momentum and its own precarious position, it was accepting partition, half a loaf rather than the whole bakery. Many Palestinians felt betrayed. They'd risked everything, buried their children, survived beatings and imprisonment, only to have their leadership concede the very thing they'd been told was non-negotiable. But Arafat had read the moment correctly. The Intifada had proven Palestinians could sustain resistance, but it had also proven they couldn't defeat Israel militarily. The stones would never overcome the tanks. What they could do, what they'd actually accomplished, was make the occupation's costs unbearable. Every day of protest, every business closed, every international condemnation added weight to the scales. Israel was winning tactically, but losing strategically, maintaining control while hemorrhaging legitimacy. By 1991, the uprising's intensity had waned, though it never fully stopped. Exhaustion set in. The Palestinian economy was shattered, unemployment endemic, infrastructure crumbling. Israeli countermeasures had become more sophisticated: mass deportations, house demolitions, extended curfews that imprisoned entire cities. And darker elements had emerged within the resistance itself. Collaborators were lynched, women accused of impropriety attacked, internal feuds settled with violence. Yet the Intifada had fundamentally altered the equation. When American Secretary of State James Baker shuttled between capitals in 1991 trying to restart peace negotiations, he wasn't talking to compliant populations anymore. He was dealing with Palestinians who'd proven they couldn't be ignored, and Israelis who'd learned that military dominance didn't equal security. This led circuitously and painfully to Oslo. In 1993, secret negotiations in Norway produced an agreement that would have been unthinkable 6 years earlier. Israel would recognize the PLO. The PLO would recognize Israel. Palestinians would get limited self-governance in Gaza and parts of the West Bank. It was far short of independence, riddled with ambiguities and asymmetries that would later prove catastrophic. But it represented something genuinely new. Both sides acknowledging the other's presence, accepting that neither could be wished or fought away. The famous handshake between Rabin and Arafat on the White House lawn in September 1993, both men looking deeply uncomfortable under President Clinton's beaming smile, was the Intifada's strange offspring. The uprising hadn't won freedom, but it had forced a conversation that decades of conventional warfare couldn't achieve. What the Intifada taught, though its lessons remain contested and imperfectly learned, was that power doesn't only flow from gun barrels, that civilians can move history, that occupied people possess agency even when denied statehood, that sustained nonviolent resistance mixed with strategic violence can shift seemingly immovable political realities. It demonstrated the profound difficulty of governing people who refuse to be governed, the limits of military force against popular movements, the way grassroots uprisings can outpace and reshape formal leadership structures. It also taught darker lessons about resistance's double edges, about how quickly movements can fracture, how violence can spiral beyond anyone's control, how the line between legitimate resistance and terrorism blurs in practice, how external powers can co-opt local struggles, how victory can feel indistinguishable from defeat when the costs mount high enough. Mahmoud, the teenager who threw his first stone in December 1987, lost 2 years to Israeli prison. When he emerged, Oslo was being negotiated. He felt conflicted watching Arafat return to Gaza in 1994, setting up the Palestinian Authority that would govern but not rule, administrate but not control. It wasn't the liberation Mahmoud had imagined when he joined those early protests, but it was something, a crack in the wall, a space that hadn't existed before. Sarah, the university student who studied in basements, worked for the new Palestinian government, helping build institutions of statehood even before the state existed. She negotiated with Israeli counterparts, struggling to transform street resistance into diplomatic achievement, always aware that the Intifada's radical energy was being channeled into bureaucratic channels, that something vital was being lost, even as something necessary was being gained. The Intifada officially ended, to the extent that such things end definitively, when Oslo was signed, but its ghost never left. The tactics it pioneered, popular committees, civil disobedience, coordinated protests, the iconography of stones against guns would resurface in later uprisings. The disappointments it generated, the promises unfulfilled, the compromises that felt like betrayals would fuel subsequent violence. Looking back, what's striking is how much changed and how little. The uprising forced Israel to negotiate, forced the world to see Palestinians as political actors rather than humanitarian problems or security threats. It demonstrated that occupation has costs, that control isn't free, that people will resist no matter how overwhelming the force arrayed against them. But it didn't end the occupation. Not then, not in the decades since. The Oslo Accords collapsed spectacularly into a second intifada in 2000. The dream of Palestinian statehood remains deferred, its shape and possibility endlessly debated and increasingly distant. The refugees of Jabaliya, where it all started, remain refugees. The settlements that dotted the hilltops in 1987 have metastasized into cities. Yet something essential happened in those 6 years of stones and tear gas, of defiance and sacrifice. A generation declared itself. A people announced they would write their own story rather than have it written for them. They proved that powerlessness isn't absolute, that the weak possess weapons the strong can't counter, that dignity can be claimed even when freedom remains elusive. The First Intifada was, depending on your perspective, a triumph or a tragedy, a revolution or a riot, a legitimate uprising, or organized violence. Perhaps it was all of these simultaneously. History's messy, contradictory human reality refusing to fit into neat categories. What's undeniable is that those young people who took to the streets in December 1987 changed their world, even if they couldn't fully control how it changed. The stones they threw landed, eventually, in Oslo and Washington, in UN resolutions and international law, in the consciousness of a global public that had previously looked away. The bones that were broken healed, but the body politic was permanently altered. And somewhere in the archives, there's still that first stone Mahmoud threw, or one like it, indistinguishable from a million others, just a piece of limestone, worn smooth by time and circumstance. It didn't break any windows or hurt any soldiers, but it broke something inside Mahmoud himself, shattered his acceptance of how things were, cracked open a possibility he'd never before imagined. That's what uprisings do, ultimately. They don't guarantee victory or ensure justice or prevent future suffering, but they break the spell of inevitability, demolish the fiction that the powerful are omnipotent and the powerless are voiceless. They remind everyone involved, the oppressed, the oppressors, and the observers, that history isn't finished, that the future isn't written, that ordinary people can still, against all odds and evidence, shake the very foundations of the world. The Intifada's legacy lives in every protest movement since, every civilian standing before tanks, every population refusing to accept the unacceptable. Its lesson, purchased with blood and imprisonment and broken families, is simultaneously hopeful and sobering. Resistance is possible, change is achievable, but the cost is always higher than imagined and the outcomes never quite what was hoped. That might not be the triumphant ending anyone wanted, but it's the truth uprisings teach, that freedom is claimed stone by stone, sacrifice by sacrifice, compromise by compromise, and that the journey from subjugation to sovereignty is always longer and more painful than the distance between oppressor and oppressed suggests.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.